All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining our Northern Forest Birds Network webinar series. And also, thanks for being flexible with time. We are at lunch today. We have our very own steering committee member, Alexis Grinde, here presenting. Her research focuses on conservation ecology, which is including studying the large-scale impacts of environmental change on wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystem function. So, applications of her research and the Avian Ecology Lab at Natural Resources Research Institute in Duluth, Minnesota, is to inform forest management decisions in relation to changing land use patterns and providing recommendations for conservation plans, especially for those species of conservation concerns. So, Alexis, thanks so much for being here today. You are like a stepping stone for our Northern Forest Bird Network and all of our forest management tools, so we really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Can you confirm you can still see my PowerPoint?
Yes, looks
Okay,
great.
awesome. Great. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here. I hope you guys all have a delicious lunch that you're eating. And again, yeah, thanks for having it at noon so I could attend. I want to talk to you today about some of the work that we're doing in the lab and that's been sort of ongoing, but then also some of the tools we've developed with the Northern Forestry Network, which has been an awesome outreach opportunity, and just kind of talk about this idea of building resilience in our ecosystems as we think about all the changes that are coming related to the environment. So, again, my name is Alexis Grinde. I run the Avian Ecology Lab at the Natural Resources Research Institute. That's part of the University of Minnesota. My group is awesome. There are 7 of us that are currently full time, and then we have a couple graduate students, and of course, a whole bunch of seasonal staff. So, for anybody that's out there that might be wanting to get more experience in doing bird related research. We're always hiring in the summers, but this is the crew. We work as a team. And so all of the data that I'll be talking about today and the ideas really are based on what our lab does in general. But they're the funnest, smartest, coolest group of people you'll ever meet. So, um, when we talk about ecosystems and we talk about forestry, we talk about nature in general, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, right? And me personally, when I think about a forest as an individual or a landowner that's out walking my dogs or looking for raspberries or something, that's different than when I go out and are doing forest bird surveys. There's sometimes overlapping ways that I see the world, but it's also sometimes super different. And so those values of nature, we can define them in a lot of different ways. So the cultural values reflect the high value placed on natural heritage and traditions that are rooted in nature. Intrinsic value is that high value of nature that's associated with biodiversity and long-term ecosystem functioning. And then the regulating values are when we talk about the natural processes that help sustain our overall societies. And so thinking about that human social interface of our of nature. I think that's important to put in the beginning of this presentation because a lot of times when we think about forestry or forest management, sometimes it's through a lens of timber harvest or growing forests for timber harvest. But really, forestry, that for natural management, supports a lot of different values. And sometimes we don't think about it because we sort of think of them as maybe a downline thing that happens. But I think in this time of really big changes that are happening in the environment, we want to sort of think about this a little bit more holistically. And so that's what we like to do in the lab. For context, we're talking about the Northern Forest Bird Network. And, when we talk about that, we're talking about really the Western Great Lakes region and the forested area. And we have a lot of wonderful forests here, and they're intact and they're relatively healthy, and that's awesome. In Minnesota, where I'm based, we think a lot about how those forests support biodiversity overall. So this map of Minnesota is from the Minnesota Biological Survey, and you can see how much biodiversity there is in the northern forested parts of the state. And so again, when we're thinking about the long-term condition of our forest or ecosystem resilience and how does that interface with forest management, thinking about biodiversity is a natural process, and we have to, again, think about that all very holistically. Now, the issues that we're facing, of course, this isn't news to anybody, but the world is changing and it's changing very rapidly. And so these are just a bunch of graphs to represent, wow, look at the temperature change that's happening across the globe the past 50 years. Um, we're experiencing climate threats, and these are things that we've never dealt with before as a human society. We certainly have never dealt with them in terms of biodiversity conservation or forest management. And so we have a new context in which we have to look at the world, right? Um, here's one of the global area reaching record temperatures. Look at the big dips in or the big spikes, I should say, in the warm records. That's wild. Um, Again, global surface temperatures, that's going up. We know that. It's super nice out in Minnesota right now. It was like 80 right before Halloween down in the cities in Minnesota. So, anecdotally, we're know that we're experiencing these things on a day-to-day basis. Precipitation has been changing. We have more extreme weather events. Affects tree cover and forestry and a lot of different other aspects of the environment as well. And then one of the things that we study a lot in our lab that interfaces with climate change are the impacts of forest pests. And so in Minnesota, but I think it's fair to say in the Western Great Lakes region, we have a couple of forest pests that are causing a pretty big impact on the overall forest health. So the one is emerald ash borer, and I know Michigan and Wisconsin have already got the wave of emerald ash borer. Minnesota, we're experiencing it currently, and we haven't had the big push through the forested parts of the state yet, but that is something that I'll be talking about today. Um, for those of you that may be unfamiliar or get your forest pets all mixed up in your brain together, but emerald ash borer is a wood-boring native beetle or beetle that's native to Asia, and it was introduced or first found in Michigan in 2002, but was probably here a while before that. It attacks all native ash trees that are more than an inch in diameter, so pretty much all ash trees. And once the ash borer infests the tree has mortality within 2 to 3 years because it eats all of the tissues that supply the nutrients to the tree. Because it's invasive, like so many invasive pests that we deal with, there's no native biological control, and really we don't have a way to silviculturally control or mitigate the impacts of emerald ash borer as well. And so, when this comes into a stand, we have 90% mortality of all of the ash trees in an area. Another one that we talk about a lot in Minnesota is the eastern larch beetle. So this is a little bit different because this is actually a native bark beetle, and it infests tamarack, or sometimes people refer to it as eastern larch. And so this is, native part of the disturbance ecology process of tamarack. However, historic records suggest that there were usually like small localized outbreaks that only lasted a year or two, and so we'd have minimal acreages that were damaged. But because we're not getting die-offs of this pest in the winter, because our winters just aren't cold enough anymore, there's a lot more reproductive action that's happening, and therefore there's a lot more disturbance that's happening. So Minnesota is currently in its 25th consecutive year of eastern larch beetle outbreak, and over 1 million acres of tamarack have been impacted. So you start thinking about, okay, the impacts of climate change, plus we have all these pests killing trees that used to not be around. What the heck is going on with our forest ecosystems? And of course, it's not just like what's happening now. We always think about too what's going to be happening in the future. What are our emerging and future forest pests? So we have mountain pine beetle that's likely going to be coming to the Great Lakes region, and obviously affects pine or coniferous forests. Spongy moths coming over from the east. White pine blister rust, something that's happening. Oak wilt, something that's happening currently and projected to get a little bit worse. And so while the forest pests used to be sort of a thing that would happen and maybe then die off, I think it's going to become more and more of an issue. And we have to think about how do we prepare our forests to deal with these sort of ongoing threats, along with being stressed from the different environmental conditions they're experiencing. And of course, I think about forests deeply and a lot, but really I love birds. And so that's what we study mostly because birds are obviously the right answer in life. But the signal that we're getting from the birds about what's happening with their populations it's not great either. So North America has lost 3 billion birds, or roughly 1 in 4 birds since 1970. This was a publication that many of you are likely familiar with from Rosenberg et al. In 2019. And so forest bird populations have declined by 1.2 billion birds. And I think that's It's an important number. It feels extravagant. It feels hard to wrap your mind around. But, anytime you see those graphs going pretty much straight down, it should cause a little like sadness in your heart and say, what can we do about it? What are the driving factors for this? And of course, for forest bird breeding species, the habitat where they breed and then make more babies, that's really, if we focus a lot of attention on there, that's really where we can get population gains and increase the number of individuals in a population. And so, how can we promote forest habitat that helps to build back these bird populations that we've lost in a pretty devastating way over the past few decades? One of the highlights that I really like about the paper from 2019 is that there's one group of birds that they call wetland bird species that had increases in populations. And of course, that was because we had a lot of legislation and policy that were going towards protecting our wetland habitat and restoring our wetland habitat. And a lot of that was driven by duck hunters, right? And then a lot of different birds benefited from that extra habitat that we put on the ground and protected. And that's a glimmer of hope, right? If we do that and we do that on large scales, we can really help maybe other birds and other habitats with concentrated funding, policies, and long-term conservation action. But yeah, in general, I mean, again, you see the red, you see the declining things. You don't have to be a scientist to figure out, things aren't going great. And of course, when we talk about climate change and it's being a primary driver of biodiversity loss, and then also climate change depends on biodiversity as part of the solution, we're sort of in this weird feedback loop where we have to sort of help promote biodiversity to help mitigate the effects of climate change. And we have to do it in a way that's also taking into account that climate change is causing a loss of biodiversity. So these things are so linked. And so, again, that holistic approach for whatever it is we're doing in terms of conservation action, we have to think about it together. So, we use this term resilient and resiliency quite a bit and maybe flippantly, and it's sort of a buzzword of the moment, I feel like, in a lot of different circles. And when we think about resilient ecosystems, a lot of times the literature will say, how long does it take for an ecosystem return to some sort of state after a disturbance? And that's really, what we're getting at is how much can we poke at a ecosystem, whether it's through climate changes, environmental variables, forest pests, fragmentation, who knows, whatever it is that we're dealing with, wherever it is we're dealing with, how can we promote that idea of resilience, both at like the stand level and across this northern forest landscape as well? And how do we make sure that it is resilient? How do we check for resiliency? How do we make sure that it's able to provide the services in terms of maybe carbon sequestration or supporting biodiversity that it did before we actually came along with the disturbances? So the definitions of a resilient ecosystem include that they support flora, fauna, and different types of microorganisms. Low resilience ecosystems can be at risk for changing into a different state. And disturbances that are large enough or last long enough can cause an ecosystem to reach a threshold, which can lead to a regime shift, right? And so the question that we ask in lab is, okay, those are good definitions. How do we um, document that that's happening? How do we characterize it? Can we quantify shifts that are happening? And what can we do to maybe prevent it and conserve different ecosystem processes that we might be interested in? One question that I like to think about a lot is when I'm out in the forest and whether it's walking my dogs or doing bird surveys or whatever I'm doing, what does an ecosystem or a resilient ecosystem actually look like? Or what does it feel like? Can I recognize it? There's a lot of different tree species, right? I kind of feel like maybe a cornfield's not super resilient, but a very diverse old growth forest is. But when we're thinking about in the context of forest, what does it actually look like? Both from the human dimension as a scientific dimension, I really don't have any idea. But of course, I really think about elves a lot, maybe in an unhealthy amount, as a scientist, obviously, you guys. But this feels like a resilient ecosystem, right? There's a lot of different vegetation layers. There's clean water. That feels like a good goal to strive to. Um, a resilient ecosystem is able to provide its essential services despite disturbances, including that maintenance of biodiversity, regulating the hydrological cycle, storing carbon, all that good stuff. And so then it comes down to getting the data to say, to ask the question, are these different ecosystems actually resilient? And how do we measure it? So there's, depending on the world in which you work, whether it's the EPA or the Forest Service or in academia or whatever, we all have our own sort of like weird ways that we look at the world and we manage the world and we set priorities for doing different types of work. And it tends to be at multiple spatial scales and we're doing different kinds of assessments and yada, yada, yada. But that feels really like non-intuitive when we're talking about ecosystem resilience and how does that matter to me, both as a human and a scientist? And so, of course, you have to put up a cute dog in a presentation. It feels very confusing, right? So what we ended up doing in my lab and then also as our different research teams is using like these ideas of indicators of ecosystem function, but not just looking at what are the trees doing or what is the birds doing. We're using a more holistic approach. And when we use that holistic approach to look at all the different pieces of that are potentially related to or an outcome of a resilient ecosystem, then we can identify the trade-offs and management priorities. Do we need to manage for carbon? Do we need to manage for biodiversity? Is there some common threads that we can pull? Are they uniquely diverse? Maybe, maybe not. So that's the gist about ecosystem resilience. Let me tell you about more of a practical sort of aspect of this. Again, I'm going to go back to talking about black ash forests. Um, and so I'm going to take you through some of our research and talk about black ash, which is pretty unique in Minnesota. But I think the framework that we've been doing a lot of the research can be useful when thinking about different ecosystems or different threats to ecosystems. And so hopefully you guys will agree that it will be useful. But I want to ask the questions like, one, are black ash forests resilient? Broaden that out. Are the forests of the Northern Great Lakes states resilient? Do our typical ways of doing forest management sort of a business as usual, again, generally through a lens of growing trees for harvest for an economic benefit, do they promote resilience? Um, do we need to promote resilient forests? Is that even worth talking about? It feels, again, kind of fuzzy and vague. And if so, how do we actually do that? So that's hopefully where we're going with this talk. One important thing is, in terms of context, is, it kind of is the interface maybe or Venn diagram of a couple of different sciences that aren't always talking to each other necessarily. Um, Wildlife ecology, forest management, and conservation. So this is where I live. This is where I get really excited about the world. And a lot of changes have happened in recent decades related to each of these fields of study, right? So if you were a student in a wildlife ecology program in the 80s or 90s, you're going to be learning different things, nowadays, well, hopefully anyway. But, traditionally, 60s, 70s, we were doing a lot of work looking at game species and managing populations. Right now, when we talk about wildlife ecology, there's more of a focus on biodiversity and more of these holistic sort of ecological assessments. Forest management, again, this varies depending on who we're talking about, so you don't need to send me angry emails, but I think it's fair to say that a lot of management for timber was related to boards and cords in the past. And now, there's a lot more conversations, really great and compelling conversations about how forest management can help to support ecosystem services and ensure long-term stability of our forest systems. And then conservation. We used to think about just putting aside these areas that are maybe important for wildlife or for whatever reason, and we call them natural areas, and we're not going to touch them, and we're just going to preserve them, and that's what we're doing. Obviously, we still do that, national parks, for example, but thinking about not taking humans out of the equation, but putting them back in the equation and thinking about ecosystem processes, diversity, inclusion of human dimensions, making sure all people have access to nature. I think that's a really important and emerging aspect of conservation as well. So, in the past, I feel like this term management is really kind of the context for how we approach dealing with nature. And it's when we're trying to kind of control things. But obviously now we have all these different threats. So whatever we were doing in the past may be still really useful and functional right now. But we also have to think maybe it's not. Maybe we need to do something more or different or just tweak our approaches just a little bit so that we can help provide that stability and that resilience to our forests and our biodiversity into the future. So I like to think of the word instead of management, promotion, which provides that active encouragement of being able to be resilient, for example. And so, I ask the question often, is it time to collectively shift from this idea of management of natural resources to more of this promoting resilience so we can ensure their long-term sustainability? And I feel like the answer is yes. And since this is a Zoom group, I'm going to assume that everybody is actively like cheering, maybe throwing confetti in the air. Hopefully, you have glitter readily available. So, yes, yes, we are going to start thinking about instead of controlling, promoting these ideas of resilience. Thanks, Ted. Um, uh, so, how do exactly do we do that? Again, I want to talk about, or I'm going to talk about this sort of black ash idea, but one of the things that I think has been disjunct a little bit in how do we approach the world compared to how do we do the science is that oftentimes as researchers, we're doing research projects and we maybe publish a peer-reviewed paper, and then we sort of just like move on to the next thing. And we don't necessarily do the outreach to get the information about our study or what the implications of our study to the managers or the interested parties that might find this information useful, that might actually do the actions to change their behavior or change, tweak management activities or something like that, for example. So I love this model, or I call it the facts, acts, and pacts model. So we do the facts, that's science. That's one part. That's the first part of the model. And then we use the science. What can the science tell us that we should either keep doing the same way or what should we do differently? And then the packs, that's my favorite part of my job when I get to talk to all these awesome people out across wherever it is they work and how can my work be useful to you and what can you tell me about your work that I can sort of incorporate in our research or think about to help me have a more holistic understanding of what's going on the world. And then we have these awesome networks like the for Northern Forest Bird Networks, um, that is a bunch of collaborators, people across the Great Lakes states where we can share information and set priorities as well. And so facts, acts, and pacts, that's the model, and that's what we try and do. Okay, so here's what we know about black ash forests is that, well, in general, forested ecosystems are facing these climate threats and forest pests. I've already sort of established that. And they're also biodiversity hotspots. We're going to focus on the black ash wetlands, but I do just want to say that the Great Lakes forested area has a ton of forested peatlands, so lowland conifer kind of forests, and they are also at risk, although I'm not talking about them today. But if you come to our in-person meeting next fall, we're going to have a focus on forested peatland ecosystems. So put that on your calendar, and we'll have more details soon. So how do we implement these facts, acts, and pacts to promote resilience in these ecosystems? Again, I want to just give credit where credit is due. I get to run the EAB project currently, but it was founded by a couple of really awesome scientists, Brian Palick, Tony D'Amato, and Rob Slezak. And we have different teams looking at different things. There's a whole bunch of people that are working on the black ash research that I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm grateful that I get to work with such amazing people. Super fun. But so we're gathering facts on black ash forests, right? So again, as a review, since I've rambled a little bit, what is a resilient ecosystem? Well, it has the ability to resist, recover, and adapt to disturbances while maintaining its ability to provide benefits. Great. And so some of those benefits, for example, are regulation of hydrological cycles, carbon sequestration, maintenance of biodiversity. Cool. Those are things we can measure out in the world. And so the first question that I posed was, are black ash forests resilient? And we don't actually know. And of course, until emerald ash borer came along, we weren't studying black ash forests. They were just sort of holes in this forest matrix. Black ash wasn't necessarily ever like a high commodity wood or anything like that. So when this threat became apparent and it was going to be a really big deal, we spent a lot of years, the research team and many others across the Great Lakes area and out east as well. We spent many years gathering facts, just trying to understand the basic ecology of the system. In Minnesota, which is again where our research is focused, there's a lot of black ash, a lot. So 1.2 million acres, 1 billion trees. Now look at all that green shading, and you imagine that all those trees are likely going to die 2 to 3 years after emerald ash borer comes in. That's a lot of not green in the map, right? One of the foundational studies that was done by a postdoc at the time, Melissa Youngquist, and she started using this term foundational species to describe black ash. And basically, through looking at invertebrates actually and litter quality and quantity and different comparisons, she found and set up this sort of framework to assess or to figure out that the entire ecosystem is more or less dependent on this one tree species based on the quality of litter that its leaves provide to the food web, and then also the hydrological function that the tree provides in terms of transpiration and regulating the swamping that's occurring in these forested wetland stands. So a foundational species. Again, we sort of just already mentioned this, but the wood boring beetle is native to Asia, high mortality. You can see that picture of larvae sort of burrowing through the wood. And it's can be hard to detect until the emerald ash borers sort of emerge. And so the tree, once it's infested, doesn't die right away. It's a couple of years before you can actually see the signs of the mortality happening. And by then, of course, it's a little bit too late. Um, in 2018, when I started studying emerald ash borer and black ash systems, that was the distribution of emerald ash borer in Minnesota, and now it's in 2024. And again, going back to this, you can see that wow, most of the black ash is in the northeastern part of the state, the forested region of the state. And you notice that as of 2024, we're really just knocking on the door of that million acres of black ash as well. Most of the mortality has been associated with green ash along the floodplains in the southern part of the state and in neighborhoods, that sort of thing. But now we're really getting to that forest ecosystem being threatened, which of course is concerning. Okay, so how do we study this stuff? We have a couple of different study designs. One is we had, again, Brian, Tony, and Rob set up these experimental sites in 2012 before I got involved with the project. And it's a really cool study design. There's 8 different sites, and within each site, there's 4 different treatments. And the 4 treatments, one is a control, so it's just a black ash functioning wetland. Then they girdled one treatment, and that's when they simulated emerald ash borer mortality by removing the bark and basically causing the tree to die slowly. And then they used some adaptive management approaches. So they used a group selection, and it was a tenth of an acre or 20% of the overall study site treatment unit to see does the black ash forest maintain its ecological function if we do some group selection harvest that might promote regeneration. And then clear cut, harvesting all of the ash, which was happening a lot so we can get the ash off the ground. There's not dead trees standing, but it also presents a potential future when there's no ash around and everything has shifted the regime. We also have an observational part of the study where we're looking at the reference conditions of black ash across the larger geographic area of northern Minnesota. And of course, we're monitoring that for changes in ash mortality and then how that's going to correlate with changes in biodiversity and hydrology and all that good stuff. Here's just a picture of those different treatments. They look very different. If you haven't ever been in a black ash forest, like go now. Maybe not in June because it's really buggy, but like in September you should go. They're beautiful, they're unique, they're old, they have these really cool structures. It's really a beautiful place. So when we're assessing these ecosystem kind of components to sort of get at the idea, are black ash systems resilient? The first thing that we looked at was hydrology, and this is led by Rob Slezak, and he has a bunch of different publications on the whole thing. But essentially what they found is that when you remove black ash, the the water table increases, and so it basically becomes a standing swamp throughout the growing season. And in an intact black ash forest, of course, it sort of dries up because the trees are taking up water throughout the growing season. So fewer ash trees. This isn't like groundbreaking science, but fewer ash trees, more water standing in these pockets. When we look at the vegetation components related to the hydrology, then we also see a complete shift in vegetation communities from a forested community to essentially like an emergent wetland vegetation community. Again, that it's driven by the hydrology and the standing water that happens when you remove the ash trees. And then depending on where you are, you'll get some alder and willow kind of growing back, and so a shrubby wetland situation happening. When we look at tree regeneration, one of the first things that they asked is, will anything just come in and replace black ash? And essentially what they found is that black ash is the dominant species. There's nothing else that's really like co-occurring in any great numbers in these black ash forests. And so just natural regeneration was not a thing that was likely to happen and is not a thing that's likely to happen. And of course, the things that will regenerate are black ash, which will continue to get devastated by EAB. So that, again, sort of what are we going to do about it? Well, we can't just leave it be because it's just going to turn to emergent wetland more or less. And one of the other things that we're looking at is carbon storage. Is carbon storage affected by EAB related mortality and then the pre-invasion treatment? So whether we did the group selection, we have a PhD student, Aaron Clark, who's looking at this right now. And so these are preliminary results, but there's big changes that happen more or less, but the herbaceous layer of carbon stocks reflects the changes in the understory. And we're going to have changes just associated with the tree mortality. And that's continuing, data is continuing to be collected on that aspect of things. So in general, when we put all these things together, wetlands stay wetter and stay wet. The vegetation regime shifts. Tree establishment becomes difficult because there's not a lot of co-occurring species and it's super wet. And so we have a loss of ecosystem function, or we can also say habitat if we're seeing it through a bird's lens. So one of the questions when I started working on it that we wanted to ask are, do black ash wetlands provide unique habitat? And the answer was yes. And in fact, we found that they're more or less biodiversity hotspots within the forest matrix. And that's likely because there's a lot of different structures that are available in black ash forests that aren't in maybe a comparable aged aspen stand, for example. There's these small gaps that open up either due to falling over because of like the water issues, or there's just a lot of cavities that are there because they haven't been harvested. A lot of subcanopy and understory diversity that's happening. But then the water component, insects love water. That's why you shouldn't go in a black ash stand in June unless I pay you. But the insect provides such a great nutritional hotspot for raising baby birds if you're looking for a place to nest in the forest. So we looked at birds, amphibians, and small mammals to sort of look at how things will shift in these experimental stands. And essentially what we found is that you get a complete regime shift. Different species are going to be in the clear cuts compared to the forests. And it's basically going to change from a forested community to more of an emergent wetland community. And emergent wetland communities are fine, but a lot of the species that we're finding in the clear cut treatments are things that you would also find like in a ditch, like when you go get groceries at Walmart or whatever. And so it's not like it's promoting a lot of different unique habitat features that are necessarily super important in this forested landscape. Okay, great. You guys bored yet? How's your lunches? Um, let's review. Are black ash forests resilient to forest pests and climate threats? The answer is no. If we disturb it and the EAB comes in, it'll cause mortality, which will cause a complete regime shift to emergent wetland habitats. can we use this to sort of think about our forests of the northern lakes states resilient to forest pests and climate threats? What other maybe cover types or age classes, however you want to think about it, might be really vulnerable to any sort of disturbance that maybe it's not evolved to sort of handle, or the long-term changes that are associated with climate change. So I think that, my answer to this is some. It's really interesting depending on where you live, I think, to do a little thought experiment and think what kind of forest that you interact with, either as a human or a scientist or whatever you're doing out in the world, which cover types are most at risk, which feel very vulnerable to a regime shift, what are the least resilient, which are likely fine for now. I don't know. And where do we just not know a lot? And again, it was forested wetlands, and we spent a lot of time, decade, trying to figure out the facts before we could actually have good actions. So, when I think about a picture like this feels not super resilient to me. This feels a little bit more resilient. This different age classes, I'm not sure. I don't know. And again, it kind of depends on where you are in the context and what your climate threats or forest pests might be, or whatever other disturbance might be occurring. But I think it's worth really sitting down and thinking about and saying, what can we do about it? Do business as usual forest management practices promote resilience? In the case of black ash, there wasn't a lot of forest management that was happening there. A lot of them had been harvested a long time ago and then are kind of like an even age system. But just because were overlooked that way, they weren't adequate. When I think about forested peatlands, I think that the forest management practices are not associated with resilience right now, and there could be a lot of improvements. And so I think the answer is maybe and maybe not. But really thinking about it through a critical lens is important. I think the question, do we need to promote resilient forests? We're going to lose 1 million acres of forested land in Minnesota because we weren't thinking about resilient forests enough previously. So I think there's a case to be made that says, yeah, that should be incorporated in every single management action that we take. We should be thinking about that. And then how do we work to promote these resilient forests? Well, going back to our black ash example, the overriding objective, whether you're seeing it through a vegetation or tree regeneration or a biodiversity or carbon sequestration, whatever ecosystem function you want to think about, the overriding objective that we all came up with was that we want to try and keep these forested wetlands forested to the extent possible and not allow that regime shift to happen if possible. Um, and so, of course, there's the arm of the study that many of you guys might be familiar with, where we're looking at what is an optimal replacement species for black ash. Can we do a lot of human intervention to go out there and plant a bunch of species that aren't necessarily out there on the landscape right now, but could provide a similar ecosystem function to black ash, which won't be available in the long term? And so we've and this is led by Doug and Brian Palick out of the Forest Research Station. So we have a lot of data. It's still ongoing. We're hoping to publish another paper soon, but we see a lot of promise with swamp white oak, which is a species that's climate adapted. So it's a little bit sort of moving it a little bit, not necessarily assisted migration. Um, the American elm is doing pretty well. Silver maple is in our new round of studies. That's also doing pretty well. And so doing the actions, the forest management of planting seedlings in forested wetlands, that's cool, right? Another thing that we've been doing from a biodiversity lens is saying, okay, where are these large tracts of black ash? Where are they maybe providing a really important function in terms of supporting biodiversity? And again, I live in Duluth, and we have an estuary called the St. Louis River Estuary, and we have a big migration flyway that comes through, especially in the fall. And there's a species called the rusty blackbird whose populations are plummeting. And we have found through a couple of different studies that they spend up to a month in a stopover in the St. Louis River Estuary and are using almost exclusively black ash forests. And so, what are they going to do when those black ash forests are no longer available? Well, hopefully we'll be able to do some sort of like Band-Aid situation and get get some underplantings happening, and we'll maintain that forested condition so that that stopover habitat will still be available for those guys in the long run. So we work with a lot of partners, including the Minnesota Land Trust and the DNR, to help get that action going on the landscape and make sure that we're thinking long term. We've identified this general prioritization scheme about, we can't protect all of the forested wetlands. What ones should we protect? And it has a lot to do with, the size, access, ownership, likelihood to become infested. And what are we going to do? Well, we can always do nothing. We could do some underplanting. Sometimes we can do group harvest, then underplanting. That's probably helpful. Um, and just clear cutting in the ash. Sometimes we might need to do that if it's long trails. When and where do we make those decisions? And so we're trying to put all our data together in sort of a advisory capacity so people can use that on whatever lands that they're managing. So I guess in summary, I didn't talk a lot about birds, so I wanted to come back to it. And in case I didn't say it enough in this presentation, birds are awesome, period. And birds are awesome ecosystem indicators. And they are great because they help inform and guide forest management practices that can help promote ecosystem resilience. Looking at the black ash forest ecosystem through a bird biodiversity lens provided so much information. Here's what's really unique about the black ash forest. It's the structures that they're responding to. It's the aquatic piece that they're responding to. That was a spatial scale that wasn't able to be captured with just looking at tree regeneration or vegetation plots or whatever. And so incorporating birds as sort of a proxy for biodiversity is something that's well established in the literature. And you also get that human component where people are like, wow, I love northern parulas. Where do they live? Tell me all about them. And so you can engage people in the environmental changes that are happening, and then also the conservation or management actions that they can maybe support on their own lands or just be educated about broadly and in general. So, thinking about how, as people that might be interested in birds, of course, because you're on this Zoom call, how can we better communicate and use our knowledge about birds and our passion about birds to really help these larger ecosystems, I think is a great opportunity. And really having that connection of if there's a lot of birds and there's a big diversity of forest birds, that's probably a really, really healthy forest. And some of those forests are threatened and some of those birds are threatened. What actions can we do to make sure both of those things are supported and conserved into the future? So the last pact of our facts, acts, and pacts model is the pact part, right? And so the pacts only become important, if we can share this knowledge and we can communicate with each other. And so one of the cool things about the Northern Forest Bird Network is, again, we have this group of interested and engaged people from all walks of life across the Great Lakes region. And we know that birds are really important and they rely on the forest, and the forest's health also relies on the birds. That's the ecosystem services and that's the connection they can provide. And it just so happens that if you think about forest management through the lens of what do birds need, you also are going to be tilting towards promoting more resilient forests. You're going to have diversity in structure, diversity in age class, diversity in composition, and that's going to make the forest more resilient long term. Michigan has completed their a toolkit to sort of provide this information in a digestible way called the Forestry for Michigan Birds. Minnesota is our resource is gonna be coming out in 2025, and then hopefully Wisconsin will be developing their resources here in 2026. Let's put it on the vision board. Um, but this toolkit is so great because again, it's typical forest management practices, but with some tweaks that help promote bird habitat that also help promote ecosystem resilience. That's awesome. We can help tell that story and get those implemented across large landscapes. We're helping our forests, we're helping our birds. So to wrap it all up, can we work together to learn to create, promote, and conserve resilient ecosystems? We have 1.2 million acres. I feel like we can make an impact on that based on the facts that we have, based on the network that we have together in Minnesota to conserve some of these forested wetlands. We talk about the Great Lakes region, we're talking about 47 million acres. Wow, that's a huge challenge, but also an amazing opportunity. when we think about how on earth can we protect these forests from forest pests and climate threats, it seems bonkers to think that, well, little old me can do anything, give a talk, get people excited about forest management or bird conservation or whatever. But I think we can do it, right? We can do it. We just have to be engaged and be thoughtful about where we're setting our priorities. So again, this is a Zoom, so I get to control your reaction, which is you're all standing and cheering and saying like, yeah, let's try, let's do this. Let's be really hopeful about the future of our forests and maintaining those resilience forests. But obviously there's a missed opportunity to put Yoda in there. Do or do not, there is no try. So let's just do it. Let's use birds to help inform forestry practices and create resilience. We can do it. Um, So I think at this point, it's really interesting to think about what else do we need to know? Where are there lacks in knowledge about how ecosystems are managed or how they're sort of functioning? Again, going back to what I had asked earlier in the talk, what forest systems might be high risk and why, and what can we do about it? Are there actions we should be taking now instead of waiting until there's an immediate threat like we did with black ash? How do we better work together to efficiently get the money and do the work across large scales? That's a great question. And how do we better share our knowledge with each other and learn from each other? Anybody that's a human on this world has something to contribute in terms of how do we increase the benefits of nature to everybody. How do we share that? How do we engage and inspire each other? Hopefully, it's through the network here that we're all associated with today, but spread it out to all your other networks that exist in the world, your neighbors as well. So, of course, you can't end a talk without quoting Eminem. That's what I always say. Um, I do feel like the world is at a point where we really need to think about it differently and act quickly. And not just wait and collect more facts and wait for the science to come out. We need to think about these things proactively, and at least we need to try. And so, I think about my career. I have 20 years left, maybe at the most. I only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. Yo. But also, Mother Teresa is a person that says smart things too. I can do things you cannot, you can do things I cannot, and together we can do great things, which is one of my favorite quotes. And I hope that that is inspiring for you guys to go out in the world, think about forests more holistically. And of course, right now it's sad times without birds necessarily, but chickadees are cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexis. I'm like LOLing over here. I wish you had a live audience because I'm sure we'd all be just like giggling. So good. Does anybody have any questions before I poke Alexis with them? Go ahead, Doug.
Okay, let me see if I can get unmuted here. I don't use Zoom very often. Yeah, I just put it in the chat. I don't even know what to say. That was I mean, I was engaged the whole time and it was very exciting. It definitely seems like a fun time hanging out with the bird nerds over there. I'm a bird nerd in Northern Ohio. So anyway, really appreciate the talk. And I actually work with birds, but I also work with wetlands for the National Park Service. So this is just super pertinent to a lot of stuff that we do, although you guys are dealing with it on a much greater scale, and you guys have the land is not as disturbed as what we have up here in Northeast Ohio. Um, yeah, so I have a lot I'd love to say, but I guess I'll just a couple of things that piqued my interest toward the end there. Because we experienced our black ash along with all our other ash trees succumbing to the ash borer about 10 years ago. And we've got plots where we actually study the veg out there. So we've got all the data. And the only difference, one of the main differences is the black ash isn't a dominant species. It's kind of co-dominant at best with red maple, American elm, and some oaks. Um, so I was going to suggest American elm. You had the species up there, but pin oak maybe would be another one. Um, you talked about getting attention. I think eBird hotspots. We've had issues in the park where whether it be like trees disappearing or trees being added, I think that the successional sites where it's a mix between forest and maybe like shrub cover, we get a lot of rare breeding like warblers and other stuff. So I think that there's a lot of eBirders out there that once they know of a hotspot where they can find those species that like the early succession stuff, um, that kind of relates to what you were talking about. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention, I guess just quickly to not take up too much time. Um, so have you, I kind of went by fast. I wasn't sure if you saw like that there was just a lack of recruitment because you're talking about, when these ashes are all going to die. Because we've seen black ash come back with a kind of with a vengeance. And it's just like the fecundity went through the roof when they were getting hit with the ash borer. So I don't know if you guys had enough, information in the study to show that you're not going to get some strong, young generation of black ash trees coming back. But anyway, like I said, we've had instances where the black ash just come back, and in a few years, I mean, they're getting bigger, and I know they're going to supposedly be susceptible to getting killed by the ash borers again. But it's too soon for us to say here whether or not that's going to continue to happen and how it's going to play out. I'm very interested in how it's going to play out here. Um, but anyway, I'll stop there. I could go on because that was a really engaging, especially for the work that I do. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Reach out to me anytime if you want to nerd out.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, regarding the recruitment question, we and it's only in the experimental sites right now because ash is just coming into the really black ash dominated forests right now. But we are seeing a lot of actually like stump regeneration on the black ash, and we're sort of hoping that, and we don't have these systems that I was talking about are pretty much dominated by black ash, and there are black ash that are more in a mixed system. We're not really necessarily worried about those because, like you said, red maple and other stuff will come in, and I think those will maintain resilience. It's really this like more this uniquely dominated areas. And so what we're kind of hoping is exactly what you described with the black ash regeneration. They'll die back. We'll get a little bit of recruitment. We know that those are going to die when they get to a certain stage, and emerald ash burr is still there. And hopefully all the other tree underplantings that we're putting will grow in the meantime. And so we'll sort of get this black ash dying, coming back, coming back. We'll have that long-term promotion, I guess, of longer lived climate adapted species that are a little bit more resilient. But one of the things that we are concerned about is that swamping out. And so when it does swamp out, we're seeing that lack of regeneration. And so if we can keep trees there to regulate the hydrology, that's kind of the game or the line that we're trying to walk.
yeah. It's going to be super interesting to watch that play out because, like, blue-winged warblers, red-headed woodpeckers, and a couple other species really benefited from these areas that opened up for our ash because we have a lot of green ash that were dominant more so than black ash around here, and it created this totally new habitat that a lot of birds actually benefited from, some of our species of concern. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mike North. We can't hear you if you're talking. Oh no. There you go. Wait. Nope.
Anticipation. It better be good, Mike.
I know. It's weird. Your mic's not working or something. Well, Mike, we still can't hear you. Can you type it in the chat? I guess Doug, I'll go back on your. Dale Gentry isn't here, but he's the Audubon in Upper Mississippi, and he did have a presentation on like some brief results on red-headed woodpeckers. Like their populations have increased in the Upper Mississippi River Valley, and I don't think it's directly related, but I think because of the ash die-off, there has been an increase in red-headed woodpecker populations. So that's been kind of interesting to see. It's it's his study, so I don't know all the details, but that was kind of like my thought was like, that must be because there's a lot of die-off. But so it's interesting to hear Ohio's having the same count.
Yeah, I definitely want to look closer. I was really excited to hear this talk and like I definitely want to look closer because we have just tons of data on bird communities, breeding bird surveys, and vegetation data from like at least 15 years worth on a lot of plots. So
Hmm.
I don't know. We're starting to kind of put some things together related to the birds, but yeah, I think there's more in there, and how it relates to this is going to be cool. And plus, us being more southerly, we have some hints of northern forest flora and fauna out here in the northeast portion of the state. It's kind of like we get more of that than any other part of the state, kind of. And so, with climate change and all that sort of thing, northward shift of species, I think it might be maybe a little bit telling as to what could be components of a resilient
Hmm.
system. So,
Interesting. Peter, did you have a comment, question?
Yeah, so Alexis was kind enough to give this presentation at an ASH or something similar at the ASH recent ASH symposium in Minnesota, and I just thought it was a great take on that. You know, just encouraging biodiversity in general and how ecosystem functionality becomes the biggest question in a lot of cases. But additionally, from just a straight management standpoint, something that came out of that I think is worth sharing as often as possible is like every ash stand isn't necessarily created equal. So one thing that I observed quite a bit in, our on the ground site visits there associated with that event was how those wetter ash sites um, definitely looked like they were on a trajectory more towards a lot of that emergent wetland habitat. Some of the plantings that took place under them had unfortunately not the greatest survival rate. In addition to the species mentioned, swamp white oak kind of was the poster child for underplanting in a lot of cases there amongst other species. But that there was just this really good habitat that, slightly more upland. I forget exactly the Minnesota DNR ecological classification, I believe, was something like MH64. Is that right, Alexis? Something like that. But you could see in the understory how that like forb diversity was much more prominent. There was a lot less competition from sedge and grasses, a very significantly drier footprint, though still, slightly wet and mesic. Um, but, the question became like, where do we start? How do we approach this problem and have the greatest chance for success, especially in our initial push to maintain some of the, you know, forested context of this habitat, the tree composition of the overstory. And those kind of slightly drier habitats that were still relatively pure ash were kind of at the top of that list. And then you'd get a little higher on the upland side of the coin, and it would get a little bit more into a mixed forest setting, and a little bit lower would be more in that wetland state, where there was, it was harder to get something established. But I thought it was worth mentioning that there was sort of that niche in between where you still have kind of that dominant ash stand in the overstory, where you could have and enjoy some success in those underplantings.
Good point. Thanks, Peter. I think we got a question here from Christian. Is there research looking into how the loss of ash from systems where other species are also present affects bird use or suitable habitat? In other words, does ash itself offer something irreplaceable, or do sites that maintain the overall forested wetland structure maintain the same value as bird habitat?
Well, we're hoping that other trees will maintain the same value of of forest
Mm-hmm.
wetland structure, maintain the same value, and support the bird community. Um, Here's hoping. But I do know from a food web dynamics point of view, there's a little bit more work to be done because the carbon to nitrogen ratio, I just felt like a real nerd, of black ashes is pretty unique to a lot of other tree species. And so the nutrients it provides to like the larval stage or the aquatic base of the food web then potentially the nutritional quality of the insects that are emerging from a black ash like swamp site or whatever might be unique. How unique or how impactful might that be? I'm not sure yet, but that is something we're kind of looking at. And so, yeah, does tree A equal tree B? Probably not, but is it good enough? Yeah, that's probably there. That's what we're kind of hoping
Mm,
for.
great. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Alexis, for this riveting presentation.
Riveting. Thank you.
Riveting. I love, I just laughed through it, but I also learned so much from talking to you. So, and then thank you everyone for attending today and providing discussion and questions. I really appreciate it. I will share this recording and Alexis's contact information if you want to talk to her more about all these things. So, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day.
Bye. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Alexis.